Welcome back to Who's That Pokemon? I am your host Brandon, and today we're going to be examining why exactly Pokémon Mania ended when it did. Pokémon has been a pop culture staple since it burst onto the scene in 1996, and those who predicted it was a passing fad were proven to be extremely wrong. However, Pokémon at one point in time was inescapable and impenetrable. It was what Fortnite or the Marvel Cinematic Universe is today times 10. I want to examine what exactly caused Pokémon to drop off the perch as the media monster it was during the late 90s. But to do that, we need to start at the beginning and see how Pokémon rose to the top. As most people now know, Pokémon was birthed from the brain of Satoshi Tajiri, who was inspired by his insect collecting hobby as a child. On February 27, 1996, Game Freak would release Pokémon Red and Green on the Nintendo Game Boy. The games were a hit immediately, and a special updated version, Pokémon Blue, was released on October 15. It was only available by mail order at the time and updated several things from the original game, including artwork, to provide the definitive Pokémon experience. Due to the explosion in popularity, it was decided that the games would be localized for Western audiences. Nintendo feared the series would tank in America, believing there was a strong chance it wouldn't appeal to American kids. They allegedly spent $50 million promoting the games to combat this concern. Pokémon Red and Blue was slated for release on October 28, 1998, almost 3 years after they had first landed in Japan. The fear that the games wouldn't find a market outside of Japan was soon put to rest, as Red and Blue sold almost 10 million copies in the United States alone. Japan had also begun airing the Pokémon anime series on April 1st of 1997, and as part of the marketing push into the West, it was decided this would be brought over too.
Prepare to join a boy on a quest. Prepare for Pokémon!
A special sneak peek was aired on September 7 in 1998 of the battle aboard the SS Anne episode as an introduction to the series, and the very next day the series aired its actual premiere. There was a genuine argument to be made at the time that the anime was more popular than the games. The main cast of Ash Ketchum, Pikachu, Misty and Brock became household names and were quickly beloved by children everywhere. Pokémon had just begun executing one of the greatest marketing strategies in history.
Pokémon, short for Pocket Monsters, was born 4 years ago as a Japanese video game. The star is Pikachu, who does light-hearted battle with 150 other characters in the #1 TV show, the #1 video game, and most of all in the popular trading cards.
They hit audiences with the anime, Red and Blue on Game Boy a month later, and the Pokemon trading card game closely followed behind in December of that same year. Much like the anime, there are cases to be made that the trading card game was as popular or even more popular than the video games at one point in time. Kids traded these around the schoolyard to no end, forcing many schools to ban them altogether due to arguments over trading and stealing. Of course, banning them did nothing at all to slow down its popularity.
I'll trade you this for a Gyarados. That for Gyarados? That's crazy!
With video games, a TV show, and a trading card game, Pokemon had 3 significant cornerstones of the 90s market covered within just 4 months of debuting in America. With Pokemon now rapidly rising, the merchandising followed. Everything from plushies and figures to board games and clothing, people were desperate to cash in on this phenomenon. Heck, in Australia they were slapping pictures of Pokemon on quite literally anything. I distinctly remember packets of Kraft cheese that had Pokemon branding and a single trading card inside. I got a Dark Charmeleon from one of these. The Pokemon franchise was riding a high that really hadn't been seen since Star Wars exploded onto the scene, so naturally the series turned its eyes to the big screen. Pokemon the first movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, debuted in Japan before the craze had even touched America, being released on July 18 of 1998. Once the series was a confirmed hit, 4Kids began producing an English dubbed version, set for release on November 18, 1999. About a year after the boom had begun in the West. The hype for this film was through the roof. Kids were stoked to see their favourite show on the big screen, and even more excited to see the legendary Mewtwo taking on Mew, a Pokemon that many people actually questioned was real or not at the time.
This fall, training is over, and the ultimate showdown begins. Kids WB presents the first Pokemon movie ever.
Movie theaters were given exclusive trading cards to give away at screenings, giving kids even more reason to nag their parents into taking them, and an excuse for them to try and potentially dupe them into taking them a second time. The movie, much like everything else in the franchise at the time, was an instant success. It debuted at #1 at the box office and made $10.1 million on its opening day, which was a Wednesday, I might add. Across the weekend, it made $31 million, breaking the record for the highest opening for an animated feature, which would only last just 2 weeks thanks to Toy Story 2. However, there was a little hiccup and some signs that things might be slowing down for the series. The second weekend saw a dramatic 60% drop, making $12.5 million. While the film was still a financial smash hit, it didn't have great legs at the box office. Worldwide, the film made $163.3 million, and domestically it made $85.7 million. A great result, but significantly less than Toy Story's $245 million for comparison. It's also interesting to note that, when adjusted for inflation, Mewtwo Strikes Back made roughly $135 million in the US. Detective Pikachu has only just surpassed it at the domestic box office, which goes to show just how much of a juggernaut Pokemon was in the 90s. With new games, more movies, and more of the anime on the horizon, could Pokemon really be on a downswing? Pokémon the first movie was a definitive commercial success, and amongst kids, it was a critical success too. At the time, I didn't know a single kid who didn't absolutely love the movie. When the film was released on VHS, that was a cultural event, and I distinctly remember how insanely hyped we all were when one of the TV channels here played the movie. Think about that for a second. We were so into this franchise that we were excited to watch the movie with commercial breaks, despite already owning it on VHS. However, non-fans of the series did not enjoy it. From the beginning, Pokemon had always had its fair share of detractors, particularly overzealous parents and talking heads on TV who would scream about it being violent, satanic, or just too big of a distraction for kids.
So Pokemon is a game that teaches children how to enter into the world of witchcraft.
These criticisms were different though. The previous adult hate was coming from people who had probably never actually interacted with the series, while these new criticisms were coming from movie reviewers and the parents who took their kids. The movie fared atrociously with critics. Negative reviews were probably to be expected, but the level of intensity to these reviews wasn't. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film was rated rotten, and just 15% of the reviews were positive. The average rating from critics worked out to be a paltry 3.6 out of 10. The critics' consensus on the site is a pretty good summary of the reviews. Audiences other than children will find very little to entertain them. Here are some of the reviews from the top critics at the time. This film is humorless, boring, impenetrable, and with animation of such staggeringly low quality that it constitutes an insult to cinemagoers of all ages. Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian. The story is a humorless retread of a Bond-style world domination yarn with a Frankenstein theme. Wally Hammond, Time Out. Pokemon isn't even good animation, unless the standard of measure is the crude LCD graphics of a Game Boy. Robin Rousey, Los Angeles Times. Personally, I think the critical hate of this movie was way overblown, and I believe that a lot of this backlash was because of a preconceived dislike for Pokemon before seeing this movie, as well as the Pikachu's Vacation short preceding it, which, it shouldn't be a knock on the movie, people didn't discredit Coco because Olaf's Frozen Adventure played before it. I could probably make a whole video on that topic, so I'll leave it for another day. You're probably asking yourself, why do the opinions of parents and crusty old critics matter? Well, reviews can actually have quite a large impact on a movie's commercial success, and while it didn't necessarily affect this movie, it certainly would have impacted the next two, and potentially may have affected the legs of this movie.
I could certainly recommend this movie for you kids. This is a cartoon with a very gentle and positive message, which is pretty clearly spelled out. My final assessment, Pokemon may be hokey for adults, but will be okie dokie with the kids.
Well, you know, if a movie is not good for adults, in a way it isn't good for kids either, because this movie, it seems to me, is basically just part of the whole marketing thing to encourage kids to be inquisitive about these Pokemon things. And I know they're obsessed by them. I know there are 4 million Game Boys out there, and they all have the trading cards, and they watch the TV show and all of that. But what is this really about? I mean...
Additionally, the parents who are bored to tears by Mewtwo Strikes Back are probably going to be hesitant to take their kids to the next one. Sure, a lot of parents would probably suck it up and sit through The Power of One just because their kids want to watch it, but you'd also have a lot of parents who'll end up not taking them. Speaking from experience, my mum often brings up how boring this movie was to her, and she even remarks that she might have fallen asleep during it. Needless to say, she passed off the Pokemon duties to my nan for the second and third installments. In my opinion, the stark drop-offs you see in money made at the box office for The Power of One and Spell of the Unknown are partially due to this. Sure, it was probably expected the sequels wouldn't do as spectacularly, but the drop was far more than you'd expect. Pokemon the Movie 2000 The Power of One hit theaters in America on July 21, 2000, just 8 months after Mewtwo Strikes Back debuted. You also need to consider that Mewtwo Strikes Back aired in hundreds of cinemas until mid-February of 2000, meaning for many people, it had only been 5 months in between films. As we saw with Solo: A Star Wars Story, even when you have a massively popular franchise, releasing a follow-up so soon can be a problem. The Power of One made a still quite impressive $19 million in its opening weekend at the box office, and $27 million in its first week. The second week saw a 65% drop though, a trend which only continued on from there. Domestically, it made $43.7 million, over $40 million less than Mewtwo Strikes Back. Funnily enough, The Power of One actually made more money than Mewtwo Strikes Back in non-US markets. The first film grabbed $77 million, while the sequel grabbed over $90. This could definitely be chalked down to the Pokemon craze reaching other countries a little slower. It reviewed poorly, albeit slightly better than the first movie, grabbing a 19% and 3.7 average rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The critical consensus was, despite being somewhat more exciting than the previous film, this kiddie flick still lacks any real adventure or excitement. What it does contain is choppy animation and poor voice acting. It doesn't match up to virtually anything out there. Again, I would argue this is unnecessarily harsh, but that's beside the point. Another reason I'd like to throw in for the potential drop in popularity is the removal of Brock from the anime. There were genuine fears that Brock's character design could potentially be perceived as racist, something they would experience with Jinx. To get out in front of this problem, they had Brock leave the cast early in the Adventures on the Orange Island season, replacing him with the milquetoast and completely inoffensive Tracy Sketchit.
Guys may need me a lot more than you guys do.
Well then, I guess this is goodbye.
Friends to the end, right, Ash?
Right.
Personally, I never minded Tracy too much, but there are a lot of fans who at the time hated Tracy, or at the very least were extremely mad that Brock was no longer part of the main cast. I'm only speaking anecdotally here, but I've noticed many fans discuss that Tracy's inclusion was a significant marker for when they lost interest in the show. The episodes where Brock joins Professor Ivy and Tracy joins the main cast aired in January 2000, relatively close to Mewtwo Strikes Back ending its theatrical run, and well before The Power of One's July release. Brock returns in a tent situation, which aired on October 7, meaning it's entirely plausible that the people who lost interest due to Brock leaving may have skipped the movie. The anime seems to have stumbled a little bit in the West here, but what about the games? Well, speaking of October, that very month on the 15th, Pokemon Gold and Silver released in America. Introducing players to a whole new world with brand new Pokemon, the franchise seemed to be as strong as ever. To date, Gold and Silver have sold 23 million copies, proving the games weren't going away anytime soon. This was proven by the avalanche of spin-off titles that began releasing around this time. Unfortunately, things on the anime side of the franchise weren't as rosy. While the move to a new region with the same beloved cast was mostly welcomed, opinions quickly soured. An early sticking point was the much discussed GS Ball. I'm going to do a standalone episode on the GS Ball, but for those who don't know, this was a scrapped plot that was supposed to introduce Celebi, but was shelved in favour of introducing it in a movie. The GS Ball was the driving point sending Ash to the Orange Archipelago and to Johto, so when Ash got to Pokeball Master Kurt and still didn't get any answers, it disgruntled a lot of fans. Going Apricorn, the episode featuring the end of the GS Ball saga, aired on March 10, 2001. Do you know what was just around the corner? Pokemon 3, the movie, Spell of the Unknown.
Complex, classic but bold. Advanced while still somehow primitive. In other words...
Yeah?
I don't have a clue.
Pikachu! You're kidding, right?
I have no idea who designed this thing, but it's protected by a very powerful lock. There must be a way to break that lock, but I don't know what it is.
Releasing on April 6, 2001, Spell of the Unknown marked the third Pokemon movie to hit theatres in under 18 months. For die-hard Pokemon fans like myself, this was heaven. But for more casual fans, as well as uninterested parents, this was way too much. It's also interesting to note that Digimon the movie was released on October 6 of 2000, and while it's not Pokemon, it's in a very similar vein. It's clear that we'd reached the saturation point when it came to theatrical movies. Pokemon Forever received a limited release on 249 screens, making $1.7 million in the US, and Pokemon Heroes released on just 200 screens to make $746,000. There would be extremely limited releases from about the 14th movie onwards, but Pokemon wouldn't properly return to theatres until I Choose You in 2017 as a Fathom event, showing on 789 screens and making almost $2.5 million. It shows you how far the series had fallen at the box office that a Fathom event in 2017 garnered more interest than a Pokemon film in 2002. Spell of the Unknown's opening weekend grabbed just $10 million, making less money than the first movie did on its first day. The movie then dropped 59%, which seems to be the trend with these films, and finished with a domestic gross of $17 million and making $68 million worldwide. Needless to say, these were the worst numbers in the franchise's short history. Even the foreign box office had dipped to just 51 million. It was clear that Pokemon movies had fallen out of favour. Maybe it's pure coincidence and I'm a conspiracy nutter, but Brock being absent before and after The Power of One releasing and the GS Ball being abandoned before Spell of the Unknown seriously seemed like they may have had an effect. As the Johto saga progressed, more and more people seemed to drop out of it. I'm speaking purely anecdotally, but I don't know many people who watched the latter half of Johto, including myself. A lot of this drop in popularity can purely be accounted for Bandwagon fans going away. You know the kids who always jumped on the hot new thing only to abandon it when something else came up? That's them. However, another big reason why people were giving up on the anime was the insane amount of filler that had been creeping into and taking over the show. Pokemon had been no stranger to filler episodes in the past. The Orange Islands was an entire filler arc, but the show was becoming incredibly bogged down with it now. Kanto flew by in a flash, with it taking 80 episodes to reach the end of the Pokemon League. We then moved on to the Orange League, which was designed to kill time, but it didn't feel like filler. Johto, on the other hand, took 155 episodes to get to the end of the Pokemon League, almost double the amount of time. I put together a list of episodes a few years back of all the episodes that had major events in them, aka a list of episodes that took out all of the filler. Each season generally has the same amount of filler except for in Johto. To give you a good understanding of how much filler there was, only 14 episodes of Johto League Champions have major events occurring in them. The rest of the episodes are filler and can be skipped with absolutely no consequences. There are 157 Johto episodes and only 47% of those episodes legitimately matter. 63% of the region can be skipped. Despite this, it might not really be the anime's fault that there was so much filler. The time between the release of Generation 2 and Generation 3 can be to blame. The 3-year gap between Generation 2 and 3 and not introducing a filler arc like Orange Islands meant they had to stall for longer. In fact, the time between Johto and Hoenn, and the move to Hoenn in general, in my opinion, hurt the franchise's mainstream popularity a lot. Pokemon fans in America had received Red and Blue in 98, Yellow in 99, Gold and Silver in 2000, and Crystal in 01. A new Pokemon game per year was expected at this point. It was the norm, and those outside of Japan knew no different. Unfortunately, this wasn't realistic to maintain, so when Pokemon made the leap to the Game Boy Advance, it felt like an eternity. Constant new content is the best way to keep a fad alive, but by the time Ruby and Sapphire hit shelves in early 2003, it was too late. It didn't help that Ruby and Sapphire received relatively mixed reviews amongst fans at the time either. A big sticking point was not being able to trade over Pokemon from Gen 1 and 2 games. While Game Freak had legitimate reasons for this, it was never going to go over well with fans. Add in the fact that the Hoenn region felt so disconnected to the rest of the series, and you have a recipe for a bit of fan backlash. While Johto was a new region, it was still connected to Kanto, and the overall region was quite similar in style. It felt like a continuation. This was not the case with Hoenn. While I feel that Emerald did a lot to turn fan opinions around, I think a lot of damage was done to older, less dedicated fans at the time. Again, anecdotal evidence, but almost every single one of my friends had stopped playing or watching Pokemon at this point. Heck, I was barely even interacting with the show and the games at this point. I think the final factor that helped see Pokemon drop down from record-breaking popularity to a more normal popularity was the rise of adjacent type shows. During the late 90s, Digimon seemed to be the only real competitor to Pokemon that followed a similar idea or style. This led to a lot of unfair comments about Digimon being a clone. Both Yu-Gi-Oh! And Beyblade began airing around the world in the early 2000s, and the concept of those shows were clearly inspired by Pokemon. These two franchises followed the format of a young kid who is gifted in an unusual type of sport, in the exact same vein as Pokemon. These series saw immense success initially, and no doubt would have eaten into Pokemon's stranglehold. Then when you have knockoffs of these series that were inspired by Pokemon like Duel Masters and Crush Gear Turbo, the entire market starts to become extremely saturated. Now, I know some of you are probably screaming at your screen right now about how Pokemon is still one of the most popular franchises in the world. And you're not wrong. It's literally the highest grossing franchise of all time. I know that Pokemon is still ridiculously popular, but for years it was inescapable, whereas now it's drowned out by many other franchises. At one point in time, Pokemon was the only thing that mattered to most kids. In the years following the missteps the franchise took, it still managed to maintain popularity, despite losing a lot of its mainstream relevance. I think a lot of this is thanks to Pokemon Emerald as well as Fire Red and Leaf Green. The Kanto remakes quelled those who were angry about the move to Hoenn and allowed them to reunite with their old favourites, and Emerald was mostly lauded by fans for its great improvements, particularly the Battle Frontier. At this point, Pokemon basically settled into a groove that it's been in for about 15 years now and has seen the same steady numbers across the franchise. However, is Pokemon poised for a mainstream comeback? Pokemon Go jolted the series back into a lot of people's minds and got lots of new people into the series. Unfortunately, Go being extremely half-baked upon its release may have stopped it from reaching its full potential in pulling even more people back into the franchise. The Detective Pikachu movie also saw a lot of buzz and has done fantastically at the box office, but it's not setting the world on fire in terms of mainstream popularity. The original Pokémon Mania was truly lightning in a bottle, and even the craziness surrounding Pokémon Go's release was only half of what it was like in the 90s. Overall, the ridiculous popularity of Pokémon was never going to last. The perfect storm that catapulted them to success was just far too hard to sustain, and it was always going to experience some sort of drop-off. Despite this inevitability and unsustainability, I think it was extremely interesting to look back on the series' history and analyse just why it dropped off when it did, and hopefully it's been an enlightening and entertaining walk down memory lane.